Yeah, I wanted to try and tie everything together here. I know it seems like we've covered a bunch of different topics, but in my head, they're kind of related. We talked about how Congress can't complete the appropriations process on time. We can't get a continuing resolution across the line that keeps the government open. We can't get Congress to act on Social Security and Medicare reform, even though we know that these are the big drivers of our deficits. We're going to pass an irresponsible a continuation of a tax cut in a couple of years. So, Jon, your job is to analyze political risk on behalf of your clients. So I'm curious, what are you saying to your clients? What are your clients saying to you about political risk here in the United States? Are any of these concerns to them, or are they worrying about other matters?
So I think there's kind of three big storylines coming out of that are related to this that our clients are tracking that we deal with. The first is like a very short-term storyline. What's the fiscal impulse going to be in fiscal year 24? How much does the government contribute to overall economic growth? And in 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023, that answer was a lot. And, because the government spent a lot of money in order to fight COVID, and a lot of that money kind of still lingering and sloshing around the system, which is, of course, fueling inflation. In FY24, which begins in October, the question is going to be, they've agreed to mostly flat funding. Will there be additional cuts beyond that? And there is this mechanism in the debt limit bill that says if the government's operating under a continuing resolution in January, then there's an automatic 1% across the board that's triggered on appropriated spending, which would be about $180 billion taken out of the economy next year over a relatively short period of time. So that actually would be contractionary for economic growth. So that's one thing they're watching. The second thing is the longer term picture. And this is less interesting to a lot of our clients who are just focused on the kind of next 6 to 12 months. But there is this question of, at what the U.S. is on an unsustainable fiscal path, and can it right itself? Now, the advantage the U.S. has is that it borrows in the globe's reserve currency. There's a ton of demand for dollar-denominated debt. And, anybody that, any of the petrostates of the Middle East, whenever they sell oil, they want to put that money somewhere safe. They put it in U.S. treasuries, and that kind of supercharges demand for U.S. treasuries and makes it easy for the U.S. to borrow. Does that shift at some point? Is there some new alternative that emerges that makes it harder for the U.S. to borrow? Most people say the answer is no. We're decades away from that happening, but it's a long-term story to watch as the U.S. fiscal situation gets worse. And the third thing that I think a lot of our clients are paying attention to is there some kind of institutional erosion in the U.S. that's meaningful? And this isn't really related to the fiscal picture. This has more to do with whether or not the outcome of the 2024 election, if President Biden wins or if former President Trump comes back, what does that mean for questions like the independence of the Federal Reserve or the independence of the Department of Justice? And there's questions like that. But those are sort of third order questions. And the much more immediate ones are about this fiscal impulse issue in the next fiscal year.
Got it.
What, we touched on this before in answer to Steve's question, but one of the big questions is everybody was expecting a recession. We thought we would have it by now, even earlier. And the economy keeps chugging along. Has the Fed been successful, do you think, in engineering a soft landing, or are there still some pitfalls out there?
It's hard to say. I mean, the cliche is that the Fed operations operate with a lag. So typically it's, in the past, it's been thought of as like 9 months. There's some arguments that suggest that the transmission mechanism between interest rate policy and real economic activity has shortened. And so we would see the results of Fed rate hikes or cuts much quicker than in previous cycles. But it's also the case that, that the credit tightening cycle from higher interest rates so far has shown very little negative impacts on the real economy. Job growth is still solid. Wage growth is still solid enough. And so because the economic boom of the coming out of COVID wasn't really driven by loose credit, wasn't really driven by low rates, then increasing borrowing costs hasn't really hurt the economy that much. There are some who think that the recession risk is really receding. And while you may see in 24 a slightly softer economy, you're unlikely to see large layoffs or massive slowing in job creation. But there are others who say, we're not out of the woods yet, and this could be a story for early 2024. So I don't really have a view on those questions. I think it's certainly possible that the effects of the Fed tightening cycle don't materialize until next year. And the most important, but so far things look pretty good. And if the Fed pauses at the upcoming meeting, which seems very likely, then they can pause, take a look at some of the data, and see if they've done enough or if they have to go higher with rates.
Well, we'll have to follow that, as will the administration and the Congress, if they can get over their CR problems in the coming weeks. But that's all the time we have for this week. You're listening to Facing the Future. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. I want to thank our guest this week, Jon Lieber, Managing Director of Eurasia Group's United States practice. Thanks to Tori Gorman and Steve Robinson for joining me. I'm your host, Bob Bixby. I'll be back next week with another edition of Facing the Future.